We asked humanity for refuge. They arrived with generals, engineers, and warships. 3 species filed it as someone else's problem before Earth had even finished translating the request. The signal came in on a civilian band, old, slow, the kind of frequency you use when you have nothing left to lose and you're hoping someone still listens to the dark. It carried a Coromni authentication stamp, which meant it was genuine. It also carried a timestamp that showed the sender had waited 2 days before transmitting, which meant they had spent 2 days believing someone would come without being asked. Nobody had come. The text of the message was 16 words in Coromni Standard, which translated into 11 words in Galactic Common, which translated into 8 words in English. Help us. They are already inside our outer markers. That was all. At listening post KL7, a junior comms officer named Sen Akoy received the transmission at 3:04 in the morning ship standard time. She was on her 4th cup of processed coffee, which tasted like warm rust, and she was halfway through a maintenance log that would have bored anyone into sleep. She read the transmission once. She read it again. Then she did something that no officer at KL7 had done in 11 years of continuous operation. She flagged it Priority Omega, which was the designation reserved for events that had no lower category. The flag lit up 3 boards simultaneously. One of them was on Fleet Marshal Iyabosa Rank's desk, in her quarters where it woke her at 3:11 a.m. Rank was not a person who needed to be told things twice. She read the transmission on her handheld before her feet touched the floor. She set the handheld down. She stood up, crossed to her desk, and looked at the cracked compass sitting beside a stack of requisition forms she hadn't signed yet. The compass was brass, scratched on the glass, and the needle sat frozen 14 degrees west of true north. It had sat that way for a decade. She had never had it fixed. She tapped it twice with 2 fingers, an old habit, the kind that settles into a person without them noticing, and the needle didn't move because it never moved, and she picked up her comm. Akoy, pull the Cradle Doctrine file and get me a full assembly roster, every species that received this signal and their current response status. A pause, then. Marshal, that file is 214 years old. I know how old it is. It's also not in my onboarding packet. It's in the system, pull it. She was already dressed by the time Akoy called back. The Cradle Doctrine was not a treaty. It had never been ratified by the Lattice Assembly, never submitted for review, never signed by anyone except the 12 officers who had written it in a conference room on Earth 2 centuries ago. It was a promise Earth had made to itself in the years after first contact, when it had seen how big the galaxy was and how many things in it could go wrong, and had decided, quietly, with no announcement, that it would rather be the kind of species that showed up than the kind that filed paperwork while something burned. The doctrine was simple. If a distress call came from any assembly member species, and if that species had no military capacity to answer it themselves, Earth would respond, fully, without waiting for a vote. It had been activated 4 times in 90 years, all 4 for crises that resolved before Earth's ships arrived. This would be the 5th. Rank was on the command deck in 20 minutes. Akoy had the roster up of 14 species that had received the Coromni signal, their response timestamps, their filed status codes. Rank scanned the list. 3 had logged it as low priority within the first 40 minutes. 4 had flagged it for committee review, which meant it would sit in a queue for 6 days minimum. 5 had not responded at all. 1 had flagged it received, assessing, which was the diplomatic equivalent of we see it, don't ask us yet. Earth's board showed Priority Omega, mobilizing. Get me convoy lead Bose, Rank said, and find me the Halloway Yard duty manifest. I want every vessel in the humanitarian class registry that's within transit range of Coromni reach. Akoy turned from her console. Her expression was careful. "Marshal, do you want me to notify the assembly before we?" "After," Rank said. "We notify them after the convoy departs." Akoi held her expression for exactly 1 second, then turned back to her board. "Yes, Marshal." There is a station 40 seconds of signal lag from Earth's primary shipyard, and it sits at the coordinates where Holloway Yard's expansion plans stopped 40 years ago when the budget ran out. The yard is not impressive to look at. It is utilitarian in the way that things built to last are utilitarian. No curves, no visible ambition, just structure that does its job and asks nothing of you aesthetically. Taran Bose, Foundry Convoy lead, was eating a meal he'd reheated 3 times when his comm chimed with Rank's authorization code. He set the food down. He read the order. He read the cargo manifest attached to it, which listed 41 vessels currently logged under the humanitarian class registry, their last departure dates, their stated function. He noted, as he always noted when he looked at this list, that 12 of the 41 were not, technically, humanitarian vessels. They were mobile orbital foundries. They could fabricate structural components, sensor arrays, and, given the right raw material input, the lattice framework for a sensor denial net capable of blinding a combat fleet's targeting systems at close range. They had been in the humanitarian registry for 11 years. Earth had never corrected the classification. Bose drained his coffee, tapped his comm, and said, "All hands, departure prep, we're not on the training clock." "I wish I could tell you the assembly noticed in time to do something. They didn't. Stay close." 6 hours later, the convoy was underway. It was a long line of ships, 41 in the registered formation, with 7 medical and logistics vessels running sweep on the rear, and from the outside, reading the manifest, it looked exactly like what it said it was: a relief operation. Habitat modules in the cargo bays, water reclamation equipment, medical supplies in quantities large enough to supply a mid-sized colony for 2 years. There were also, inside the foundry ship's fabrication bays, components that did not appear on the filed manifest. They had been loaded in the last hour before departure, quietly, by a crew that had been briefed on what they were carrying and had said nothing except understood. Rank watched the convoy leave Holloway Yard from the command deck of her ship, which was logged in the registry as a logistics command vessel, and which had, in its weapons bays, a complement that its registry listing did not mention. She watched the formation settle into its transit vector. She watched the yard's running lights slide past the viewport. She tapped the compass twice. The needle didn't move. She turned to Akoi. "Notify the assembly, Cradle Doctrine 5th activation, destination Koromni Reach." Akoi sent the notification. It went to all 14 assembly species simultaneously at 9:47 a.m. ship standard. The first response came back in 11 minutes. A formal acknowledgement from the Lattice Assembly's duty secretariat, stamped with a case number, marked for committee review at the next scheduled session. The next scheduled session was in 4 days. The Lattice Assembly was 9,600 years old. It had been built in concentric rings around the core of a dead star, and the rings had been added one by one as species joined, so that the oldest member species occupied the innermost ring, closest to the star, and newer members occupied the outer rings, which were brighter and louder and further from the center of decisions. It was the kind of structure that told you everything about how it worked just by looking at it. On its floor, species voted by standing in lit circles. The circles were color-coded by member seniority. To change a resolution, you had to physically move from one circle to another, which had been designed as a deliberate mechanism. The architects wanted any shift in position to cost something, even if only effort. It was a body built for deliberation, not speed. Iravel Das was a junior Tessari diplomatic attaché, 23 years into what her government expected to be a 40-year posting, and she had been on the assembly floor when the Koromni signal arrived. She had watched the species around her check their boards, exchange looks, return to the conversation they'd been having. Then, 11 minutes after the relay from Earth, she had looked at the Earth delegation's status board out of habit, the way you check something when you're not sure why, and seen the word she didn't recognize. Mobilizing. She had asked the delegate beside her what it meant in Earth context. The delegate, a senior Tessari career diplomat with 40 years in the assembly, had looked at the board for a moment and said, "I don't know. I've never seen it used." Iravel pulled up the Cradle Doctrine file on her personal slate. It was 214 years old, unsealed, publicly accessible. She read the first 3 paragraphs. She read them again. Then she sat very still, because she was trying to understand what it meant when a species had written itself a promise, and had kept it quietly for 200 years, without ever telling anyone they were doing it. Warlord Marshal Asen Threl received his first intelligence report on the convoy 8 hours after it departed Holloway Yard. He was on the bridge of the Bonecutter, which was the flagship of the Drenic Ascendancy's 6th campaign fleet, and he was reviewing his formation's position relative to Coromni Reach's outer markers. The Coromni had no military. They had not had a standing military for 6 centuries. This was not a campaign. It was a correction, the kind of action the Drenic Ascendancy took when a territory's resources exceeded its political utility as a neutral party. The intelligence report was 3 paragraphs. It listed the Earth convoy's registered vessel count, their filed humanitarian classification, their transit vector. It noted the convoy was large for a relief operation. It did not note anything else, because the officer who wrote it had read the manifest and found nothing in the manifest that required escalation. Threl read the first paragraph. He checked the vessel count, 41 registered, 7 logistics, against his own formation's numbers. He set the report down. "Humanitarian operation," he said. "Earth is sending food and water." He handed the report to his aide without looking up. "File it low priority. Monitor for any deviation from their transit vector." His aide filed it. The Bonecutter continued its approach. On his threat board, the indicator for the Earth convoy stayed at the lowest tier, a pale amber light, barely a flicker, the color the system used for events that required no response. It did not move. The convoy dropped out of transit at Coromni Reach 14 hours later. The outside, it looked like relief work. The first ships to reach the outer markers were the medical vessels, bright painted, transponders broadcasting on the civilian humanitarian frequency, their cargo manifests openly available to any scanner in range. Behind them came the habitat modules, the water reclamation units, the supply ships. Behind those came the foundry vessels, which were larger and slower and registered as construction support, because that was what their manifest said they were. The Coromni way station at the Reach's edge had taken damage to 2 of its 4 docking arms. Taran Bose brought his foundry lead ship alongside the undamaged arm and opened a channel to the station's engineering chief. "Bose, foundry convoy lead. We have materials and personnel for your station repairs. Where do you want us to start?" The engineering chief, a Coromni woman named Selaveth, answered in a voice that was very careful and very steady, which is the voice people use when they are trying not to let relief turn into something they can't control in front of strangers. "Docking arm 2 is the priority. The structural joint at the base is cracked. If we lose the arm before the second wave comes—" "Send me the stress specs," Bose said. "We'll have a fabricated joint ready in 6 hours." He cut the channel, turned to his crew. "Standard cover pace on the visible work. Fabrication Bay 3 starts the net framework now. Nothing on external sensors that doesn't match our manifest." Nobody asked questions. This crew had been briefed, and the briefing had been clear. If you are watching this operation from the outside and you know what you are looking for, you will see a relief convoy doing relief work. If you do not know what you are looking for, you will see the same thing. Taran Bose was good at making those two views identical. 3,000 kilometers from the Koromny way station, the Bonecutter's long-range array was watching. It saw medical ships docking. It saw habitat modules being positioned. It saw, in Fabrication Bay 3 of the lead foundry vessel, a heat signature consistent with active construction, which was exactly what a foundry vessel was supposed to produce. The system logged it as consistent with filed manifest. It did not log the specific shape of what was being fabricated, because the shape required a specialized interpretation filter that the Bonecutter's array was not running. Threll had not ordered it run. There was no flag in the system that suggested it needed to be run. The amber light on his threat board held. On the assembly floor, Iravel Das had spent the night reading. The Cradle Doctrine file was public, available to any member species, and had apparently never been read by anyone outside Earth because it had never needed to be. It was 12 pages long, written in plain technical language, and it said what it said without qualification. In the event of a distress call from any assembly member species with no standing military capacity, Earth Defense Directorate will respond with full available force. This response requires no assembly vote, no committee review, and no secondary authorization. The word full appeared 7 times in 12 pages. She had marked all 7 instances. She was sitting with her senior delegate, Myrth Asa, at the Tessari observation post on the assembly floor's outer ring. The floor below them was murmuring with its normal crosstalk, 40 species, conducting the slow, deliberate business of a 9,000-year-old governing body, which mostly consisted of arguing about trade lane classifications and resource survey rights. They wrote this 200 years ago, Iravel said, and no one outside Earth ever asked about it. Myrth set down her tea. She was 61 years into her posting, which meant she had seen things that Iravel had not, and her silences tended to mean more than her words. They didn't advertise it, she said. But they kept it current. The doctrine file has been reauthorized every 10 years. The last reauthorization was 8 months ago. Myrth picked up her tea again, said nothing. What does that mean? Iravel asked. It means, Myrth said slowly, that someone on Earth has been signing their name to this promise every 10 years for 2 centuries, whether they expected to need it or not. She looked at the Earth delegations board, which still showed mobilizing, and now they need it. Iravel looked at the board too. She thought about the word full. She thought about 41 ships. She thought about the word available, which the doctrine used without defining an upper limit. She pulled up the Earth Defense Directorate's public registry, which was also available to any assembly member species, and had also apparently never been closely read. She started counting ship classifications. The sensor denial net took 9 hours to build. Bose ran his foundry crews in shifts, 3 teams cycling through Fabrication Bay 3, while the public-facing work continued on the station's docking arm. The joint for Arm 2 was completed in 5 hours, ahead of schedule, and installed while the net's inner framework was still being assembled. The Koromny engineering chief came to thank Bose personally, and Bose accepted with a nod, and neither of them spoke about what was being built in Bay 3. The net's design was simple in principle and difficult in execution, a distributed array of sensor interference nodes, each one small enough to read as construction debris, that when activated simultaneously would collapse the targeting resolution of any combat array scanner within close range to near zero. It did not destroy anything. It did not fire anything. It simply made the space around Koromny reach, for approximately 40 minutes, impossible to aim through with precision. 40 minutes was what the plan required. Rank had calculated this with her staff 6 hours into the convoy's transit. She had looked at Threll's fleet composition, available from Assembly Military Registry filings, which Drenic vessels were required to submit, and she had looked at the Allied ships currently in transit, and she had done the math, and the math had said 40 minutes would be enough. She tapped the compass twice, sent the confirmation. The Drenic intelligence officer's name was Sale Korath. She had been in this post for 4 years, which was long enough to understand that the warlord marshal valued brevity and disliked detail he had not asked for. She wrote her reports accordingly, short, direct, ranked by threat level, with supporting data in the attached appendix for anyone who wanted it. She filed her second report on the Earth convoy, 11 hours after the first. This one was different. The first report had logged the Foundry heat signatures as consistent with manifest. The second report, after running a specialized interpretation filter that Korath had ordered on her own authority, because something in the thermal profile had bothered her, noted that the specific shape of the construction in Fabrication Bay 3 did not match any component in the station's filed repair plan. She had cross-referenced the shape against known military hardware. She had not found an exact match. She had, however, found a partial match, close enough that she had written, in the report's summary line, the following: recommend immediate escalation and reclassification of convoy from non-military to contingency military pending further analysis. She submitted the report at 3:12, Convoy Standard Time. She flagged it for Warlord Marshal Threll's personal queue. She waited. At 600, she checked the queue. The report was still there, unread, the small indicator beside it showing it had not been opened. She sent a follow-up flag. At 800, the follow-up flag was also unread. Sale Korath sat at her station and looked at her screen for a moment. She had a third option, which was to walk to the bridge and deliver the report in person, which was a thing officers in the Drenic Ascendancy did only in genuine emergencies, because it implied the warlord marshal had failed to manage his own queue. She thought about the thermal profile. She thought about the shape in Fabrication Bay 3. She began composing a third report, consolidating everything, flagged highest tier, with the summary line in the first sentence rather than at the end. She did not yet know she was already late. This was the moment, though no one watching from outside would have marked it as such, when the engagement effectively ended. Not the 31-minute battle that came later, with its SensorNet activation and its allied pincer and its geometric precision. That was the execution. This was the decision. A junior intelligence officer composing a third report that would go unread, and a warlord marshal who had spent 22 years learning to recognize threats by how they looked, and had never considered that a threat might be designed to look like something else entirely. His core flaw was not arrogance, exactly. It was something quieter and more durable. He had spent 2 decades training himself to treat unfamiliar variables as irrelevant, because, in his experience, unfamiliar variables in enemy fleets were usually errors in his own data, not genuine anomalies. He had been right about this enough times that it had become reflex. He was not right this time. The Allied ships arrived in 3 waves. The first wave, 6 vessels from 2 species that had been quietly running joint exercises with Earth for 11 years, dropped out of transit at the Reach's far edge. Their transponders identified them as survey and assessment craft, which was a classification they held legitimately, and which was also, like the Earth Foundry ships, not the complete picture of what they were carrying. The Bonecutters array flagged them. Threll looked at the count, looked at their listed classification and said, "Survey ships, they're here to observe the relief operation." He turned back to his formation's approach vector. The second wave arrived 4 hours later. 8 ships, 3 species. Their assembly registries listed them as medical support and logistics coordination. They took positions at vectors that, if you were plotting approach geometry, formed the beginning of an encirclement pattern, but only if you were plotting approach geometry, which the Bonecutters' tactical display was not doing, because no one had asked it to. Iravel Das, watching the assembly's live tactical feed from the outer ring, had asked it to. She was not a military officer. She did not have formal training in fleet geometry, but she had been reading the Earth Defense Directorate's public registry for the past 6 hours, and she had found in its ship classifications a phrase that kept appearing in the records of vessels currently listed as survey or medical support or logistics coordination. The phrase was Cross-Strain Joint Doctrine Operations, Earth Defense Directorate. She counted the vessels carrying that notation. Then she sat very still, because the number she arrived at was larger than she'd expected, and the geometry on the tactical feed had begun to look less like a cluster and more like a shape. She thought about the word full in the cradle doctrine. She thought about available. She leaned toward Myrth Asa and said, quietly, I think we are watching Earth's entire answer. Myrth looked at the feed, said nothing for a long moment. How many ships? She said finally. Iravel told her. Myrth set down her tea and did not pick it up again. The third wave dropped out of transit 9 ships at the Reach's inner edge, and at that moment, Sail Korath walked onto the Bonecutter's bridge with her consolidated report in her hand, because she had decided the emergency threshold had been crossed, and she gave it to Threll directly. He read the summary line. He looked up at his tactical display, which was now showing the updated vessel count, the updated positions, the vectors that his system, running, now, the interpretation filter Korath had specified, was beginning to render as something other than a cluster. Something other than a relief operation. He looked at the positions for a long moment. He looked at the foundry ship in the center of the Coromni Way Station's docking configuration. He looked at the vectors of the Allied ships and the space between them, which was closing in a way that was not consistent with survey operations or medical support or any humanitarian classification in the Assembly's registry. He looked at all of this. Korath, he said, when did the second report come in? 11 hours ago, sir. Threll said nothing. The follow-up flag was 8 hours ago, Korath said. Her voice was flat, which was the tone Drennic officers used when they were delivering information that had consequences they did not want to name. The tactical display updated. The geometry resolved into something a military officer with 22 years of campaign experience could read in under 4 seconds. Threll read it. He looked at the amber light on his threat board, which had not moved, which was still at the lowest tier, which had been set there by his own hand 14 hours ago. He reached out and reclassified it himself. The light shifted to red. On the Lattice Assembly's live tactical feed, 412 delegates watched the Bonecutter's threat board change color. Threll gave the intercept order at 8:47, and the Bonecutter was already moving before the order finished transmitting to his wing commanders. He had made his decision the way he made all decisions fast, clean, with the confidence of a man who had issued intercept orders 23 times in his career and had never once needed to reconsider one. The geometry on his display showed a convoy clustered around a damaged way station, Allied vessels at range but not yet in tight formation, and his own fleet between them and open transit space. He had numbers. He had position. He had 22 years of campaign experience telling him that a humanitarian convoy caught mid-construction was not a combat asset, regardless of what Korath's report said about thermal profiles. He had been wrong about the report, he accepted that, but he was not wrong about numbers. All wings intercept formation, he said. We move on the convoy, fast approach, close to interdiction range before they can reconfigure. On the Bonecutter's bridge, Sail Korath returned to her station and said nothing. She pulled up her display, looked at the foundry ship's last logged position, looked at the thermal signature she had flagged 11 hours ago. She began running a second interpretation filter, the one that checked for distributed array configurations. She ran it because she was that kind of officer, the kind who keeps checking even when the decision has already been made, even when there is nothing to do with the result except know it. The filter took 4 minutes to process. She would have the result in time to watch it become irrelevant. On the Holloway's Promise, Renk's command vessel, logged in the humanitarian registry as a logistics coordinator, the alert came through at 8:49. Renk was at her desk. She had slept 3 hours, which was what she allowed herself when an operation was in its final approach. Her coffee was cold. She had not noticed. She was reading Bose's last fabrication update, which said the net's outer nodes were in position and the activation sequence was loaded. Her comm officer, a young man named Cressa who had been on her crew for 2 years and had never seen a live engagement, turned from his board and said, "Marshal, Bonecutter is moving. Intercept vector, direct approach." Renk set down her coffee. She picked up her cracked compass, held it for a moment, not tapping, just holding, the way you hold something familiar before you do something you can't take back, and set it down again. "Signal Bose," she said. "Net activation on my mark, not before." "Yes, Marshal." "Signal Allied wing leads. Hold vectors. Do not close until the net is live." "Understood." She looked at the display. The Bonecutter was fast for a flagship. She had noted that from the registry, factored it into the timing. Fast meant it would reach interdiction range in approximately 19 minutes. The net needed the Drenic formation inside a specific radius to be effective. Too early, and they'd abort and reconfigure. Too late, and targeting would have already locked. There was a window of about 90 seconds. "Cressa," she said. "Marshal, start the clock." The Drenic formation crossed the outer marker at 9:01. From the way station, the approach looked overwhelming. A combat fleet moving at speed, transponders broadcasting military classification, formation tight and professional, and aimed directly at the clustered relief ships. The Koremni engineering chief, Sela Veth, had been told what was coming. She had returned to her station, closed the external feeds, and begun a quiet inventory of the supplies that had already been offloaded. She did not watch the approach. She counted crates of water reclamation parts. She found this helped. On the Bonecutter, the targeting array spun up. Threll watched his display show the convoy growing in resolution as distance closed, the medical ships, the habitat modules, the foundry lead at the center, the Holloway's Promise in its logged position at the formation's rear. He had seen the full composition now. He had decided, looking at it, that Korath's concerns about the foundry were probably accurate and probably too late to matter. At interdiction range, with his targeting locked, what was inside the foundry ship's bay was no longer a variable. 9 minutes to interdiction range. His targeting officer called out lock acquisition progress. 80% resolution on primary targets. 84. Renk's clock read 11 minutes elapsed. She said, "Mark." The sensor denial net activated in 0.3 seconds. It did not look like anything. There was no visible pulse, no energy discharge that a passive observer could see. What happened was quieter. 417 nodes, each one smaller than a standard hull plate, broadcasting simultaneously on a frequency band that sat just below the threshold of the Bonecutter's active array calibration. The effect was immediate and total. Threll's targeting display dropped from 84% resolution to 11% in under 2 seconds. The numbers kept falling, 8%, 3%, and then the display showed something it had never shown in 22 years of operation under 3 successive warlord marshals. It showed a targeting status of unresolvable. The targeting officer said, with remarkable calm for someone whose board had just gone blank, "Sir, we have lost targeting resolution on all primary contacts." Threll stared at the display. "All contacts," the officer said again, "fleet-wide." On the tactical plot, the convoy's positions were still there, logged locations, last known vectors, but the real-time targeting data was gone. He was looking at ghosts. He could fire, but he would be firing at positions that were already seconds out of date, and in space, seconds were kilometers and kilometers were misses. "Countermeasures," he said. "Running, sir, no effect." "Source: distributed. We cannot isolate a point of origin." Threll looked at the display for 3 full seconds. This was, for him, a long time. "Full stop," he said. "Hold formation." The bone cutter decelerated. In Fabrication Bay 3, Tar and Bose had already moved to the next phase. The Foundry ship's external configurations changed in 90 seconds, panels retracting, new transponder profiles loading, the humanitarian registry codes going dark as the vessel's actual classification came online for the first time in 11 years. The targeting data they broadcast was not the soft civilian ping of a relief convoy, but the tight, narrowband military identification of combat-rated Earth Defense Directorate vessels. Not all 41 ships, 22. The other 19, the Foundry ships, the medical vessels, the logistics units, held their positions. They had done their work. The 22 that remained were something else, and they said so. Rank watched her display update. The 22 combat vessels had moved, in the 90 seconds of net activation and formation shift, from their registered positions inside the humanitarian cluster to a spread that her tactical officer described as tight engagement geometry, which was accurate. They were positioned between Threll's fleet and the way station, and they were no longer pretending to be anything other than what they were. "Open a channel to the bone cutter," Rank said. Cressa opened it. Rank said, "Warlord Marshal Threll, this is Fleet Marshal Iabosa Rank, Earth Defense Directorate. You are inside Coromni sovereign space. You are at a military disadvantage. I am offering you one opportunity to withdraw." She waited. The channel stayed open. She could hear the bone cutter's bridge, the quiet movement of officers, the low tones of a crew that was recalibrating. Threll's voice came back flat, the translated version stripped of whatever texture his actual words had carried. "You have 22 vessels, Marshal. I have more." "You have targeting resolution of less than 4%, Rank said. "Your formation is stationary. Your retreat vectors are about to become complicated." A pause. "How many Allied ships?" he said. It was the right question. It was also the first time in the engagement that Threll had asked a question instead of issuing a statement, and everyone on the Halloway's Promises bridge heard the difference. Rank looked at her display. She said, "Enough." She cut the channel. This was the moment Sail Korath, second filter finished processing. The result populated her screen in a table: node count, distribution pattern, activation radius, and she looked at it. And she understood what she was looking at, which was the architecture of the sensor denial net, reconstructed from the thermal data she had flagged 11 hours ago. She understood what it meant. She understood that the convoy had built this while her reports sat unread in the Warlord Marshal's queue. She also understood, looking at the table, that the net was only half the answer. The other half was the geometry of the Allied ships, which she now pulled up, running the approach vector analysis she had been trained to run, but had not been asked to run until this moment, and which showed, clearly, the vectors converging on the bone cutter's formation from 3 directions. Not 2, 3. She had counted 2 waves. There was a third. She turned to flag this for Threll. Then she stopped, because the tactical display was already showing it. The third wave dropping out of transit at the Reach's far vector, 9 ships, closing fast, cutting the last open retreat lane with the unhurried precision of something that had been planned from the beginning. No warning, no declaration, no hesitation. She filed the analysis report anyway because she was that kind of officer. She noted the time, 9:14. She noted that the engagement had been, at this point, effectively over for 11 hours and 3 minutes, since the moment Threll had filed her second report unread. On the Lattice Assembly's live feed, The delegates were silent. Not the normal silence of a body waiting for translation, or the strategic silence of species calculating their positions. This was something else, the silence of 412 representatives who had been watching a screen for the past 22 minutes and had stopped having anything useful to say. Iravel Das was one of them. She had her slate open. She had been writing notes in her own shorthand, trying to build a vocabulary for what she was observing, and she had crossed out 3 different words in a row because none of them were right. Not rescue. That implied the rescuers had been asked, had considered, had chosen. This had not looked like a choice. It had looked like a reflex. Not war. There had been no declaration, no escalation procedure, no formal notice of hostile action. Not deterrence exactly, though that might be part of it. She looked at the engagement geometry on her feed. She looked at the 22 combat vessels that had appeared from inside a humanitarian formation. She looked at the Allied ships on their staggered vectors, closing retreat lanes that she now realized had been calculated from the beginning, and she thought about the 11-year-old classification error that Earth had never corrected, and she thought about the Cradle Doctrine's 12 pages and the word full appearing 7 times. She wrote a new word on her slate. Then she crossed it out too, because it was still not right, and she sat looking at the engagement feed with the uneasy feeling that she was watching something for which her language, and possibly everyone's language, did not yet have the right name. Myrth Asa beside her said quietly, "Iravel." "Yes." "When this is over," Myrth said, "you are going to write the first draft of our report. Not me, you." Iravel looked at her. "Because I have been in this assembly for 61 years, Myrth said, "and I do not have words for what I am watching. You might." Iravel looked back at the feed. On the screen, the bone cutter had not moved in 4 minutes. Its formation was holding. Its targeting arrays were still showing unresolvable. The Allied ships were still closing. In the engagement, there was a shape, not of violence, but of completion, the way a door closing looks different from a door being shut. Something had been set in motion 200 years ago, and it was still in motion, and it was arriving now, and it had always been going to arrive. She did not write anything else. She watched. The bone cutter held position for 6 minutes. 6 minutes was a long time in an engagement. It was long enough for the Allied ships' vectors to close another 800 kilometers on the formation's flanks. It was long enough for the sensor denial net to cycle through its second maintenance pulse, confirming it was stable and holding. It was long enough for Threll's wing commanders to transmit 3 separate requests for orders, each one more carefully worded than the last, which was the Drenic military's way of saying we are waiting, and we would like to stop waiting without saying it directly. Threll did not answer them. He stood at the center of his bridge, and he looked at his tactical display, which was showing him a situation that his 22 years of campaign experience were processing one variable at a time, the way you process a thing when it does not fit any template you have ever used. The Foundry ships, the classification error 11 years uncorrected, the Allied vessels on vectors that had been calculated. He understood this now, looking at the geometry before the convoy had departed Earth. Not improvised, not reactive, planned. The staggered waves, the specific spacing, the way the third wave had appeared at precisely the moment his own formation had committed to its intercept vector and could no longer abort cleanly, all of it planned. Not for this engagement, for the possibility of this engagement. Someone had built a response not to the Coromni crisis specifically, but to the category of event the Coromni crisis represented. They had built it years ago, or perhaps decades ago, and they had kept it current, and when the signal came they had loaded it and sent it, and it had arrived looking like water reclamation equipment and habitat modules. He thought about the 12 Foundry ships in the humanitarian registry. He thought about the 11-year classification error. He thought they never corrected it because it was not an error. His aide, standing 2 meters to his left, was very still. His bridge crew was very still. They were all waiting, and he could feel the weight of the waiting, and he understood that every second he stood here was a second the Allied ships used to close another vector. He crossed to his console. He picked up his comm stylus, a habit, something to hold when he was thinking, and he turned it over once in his hand, the way he always did before giving an order he could not take back. He set it down. "Get me the assembly open channel," he said. Renk was drinking cold coffee when the channel request came through. She had poured a fresh cup 20 minutes ago and had not touched it. Cressa flagged the incoming request and she set the cup down, straightened, and said, "Put it through." Threll's translated voice was flat and without texture, the way all translated speech was flat, which meant she was reading him entirely from what he chose to say and how long he took to say it. He said, "Fleet Marshal Renk." "Warlord Marshal." A pause, not long, 2 seconds, maybe 3, but she heard it. "Your convoy manifest," he said, "the Foundry classification." "Yes. It has been wrong for 11 years. That is what the registry shows." Another pause. She waited. She had learned a long time ago that the pause before a man like Threll spoke was where the actual decision lived. Everything after was just the announcement. "I am withdrawing my fleet from Coromni Sovereign Space," he said. "I am filing a formal incident report with the Assembly. I expect a response to it." "You'll have one," Renk said. "Safe transit, Warlord Marshal." She cut the channel before he could respond, because there was nothing useful left to say, and because she had found that giving a retreating force the last word cost nothing and occasionally meant something. She looked at her display. The bone cutter was already moving slow at first, then accelerating on a vector that her tactical officer flagged as clean exit, no secondary threat posture. The winged ships followed, precise and disciplined, which she noted. A rooted force panicked. A professional force withdrew in formation. Threll was losing this, and he was losing it with his organization intact, which meant he would be back in a command chair inside a year. She wrote that down. She would put it in her after-action report. The engagement lasted 31 minutes from net activation to the bone cutter's change of vector. Renk did not watch the withdrawal from the bridge. She went back to her desk, sat down, and opened the after-action log. She had forms to file. The Cradle Doctrine required a detailed account within 6 hours of engagement end, signed by the acting fleet marshal, witnessed by the duty officer, transmitted to the Directorate and simultaneously to the Assembly Secretariat. She pulled the first form. It asked for engagement duration. She typed 31 minutes. It asked for Earth casualties. She typed none. It asked for enemy casualties. She typed none. It asked for primary objective status. She typed Coromni Sovereign Space secured, besieging fleet withdrawn, way station repair operations continuing per schedule. She looked at that last line for a moment. Per schedule. Bose's Foundry crews had gone back to work on the docking arm joint within 4 minutes of the net deactivating. The station's engineering chief had sent a message that said simply, "Arm 2 is holding. Thank you." It was addressed to the convoy lead, not the fleet marshal, which was correct. Bose had done the work. Renk reached for her compass. She tapped it twice. The needle moved. Not far, 1 degree, maybe slightly less, a drift so small she almost didn't see it. But it moved and it held. The glass was still scratched. The case was still cracked. The needle sat at 13 degrees off true instead of 14, and she looked at it for a long moment and she could not explain it, and she did not try. She went back to her forms. On the bone cutter, the withdrawal was silent. Not tactically. The bridge was running full protocols, the wing commanders reporting in, the formation holding its spacing with the precision that Threll demanded and always got. Tactically, it was orderly and correct. But no one was speaking beyond what the protocols required. No one was offering analysis or context or the small conversational bridges that a bridge crew used to fill the space between decisions. They were doing their jobs and they were doing them quietly, and Threll stood at the center of it and let the silence be what it was. Sail Korith was at her station. Her third report was still open on her screen, the one she had filed at 9:14, the one that had been read finally, fully, by the Warlord Marshal at 9:21, 7 minutes into the withdrawal. She had not closed the file. She was looking at the timestamp on the second report, the one filed at 3:12, the one that had sat unread for 9 hours. She thought about the word contingency military in the summary line of that report. She thought about the fact that she had been right, and that being right had not mattered, and that being right had not mattered because the report had not been read, and that it had not been read because the Warlord Marshal had already decided what the convoy was before the evidence arrived. She closed the file. She opened a new one. She began writing her own after-action report, which was not required of her rank but which she intended to file anyway. She wrote the timestamps in order. She wrote what she had flagged and when, and what had been done with the flags. She wrote it plainly, without editorializing, because the timestamp spoke without editorial. She did not know what would happen to the report. She filed it anyway. Outside the bonecutter's viewports, the stars were moving, the slow, steady movement of a ship in transit, heading away from Coromny Reach, away from the 31 minutes that would appear in the after-action logs of 6 species defense directorates, and in the Assembly's formal record, and in whatever Iravel Das was writing on her slate on the Assembly floor. Threll watched the stars move and said nothing. He had spent 22 years learning how fleets broke. He had never seen one disassembled so quietly. No declarations, no escalation, no warning, only the slow, patient construction of a situation in which the warning had already been given, years ago, in a 12-page document that anyone could have read. His wrist cord caught the light, the rank insignia of defeated commanders, braided in, each one a name and a campaign, and a certainty he had been right to press. He had not lost a fleet engagement in 22 years. He did not touch the cord. He watched the stars. The Assembly's grand convocation floor returned to sound slowly. Not all at once. First one delegate, then two, then a cluster, small conversations restarting, the low translated hum of a body beginning to process what it had watched. It took 11 minutes for the floor to reach its normal volume, which was the longest measured silence in the Assembly's recorded history, which was a record that went back 9,000 years. Iravel Das noticed the silence end the way you notice something only once it stops. She had not realized how total it was until the sound came back, and then she sat for a moment with the contrast of it. She looked at her slate. She had 3 words written on it, each one crossed out. Below them, she had written a 4th word and not crossed it out yet, though she was not sure it was right either. She was looking at it when Myrth Asa spoke. "Well," Myrth said, "write something." "I'm trying." "You have 30 years of diplomatic training. Use it." Iravel looked at the tactical feed, which was now showing the bonecutter's withdrawal vector, the Drenic formation in clean retreat, the Earth convoy still clustered around the Coromny way station, with its foundry ships running fabrication schedules that matched their original humanitarian manifest. From the outside, from the data, it looked like a relief operation that had been briefly interrupted and was now continuing. That was, she supposed, one way to describe it. She thought about the Cradle Doctrine's 12 pages. She thought about 41 ships in a humanitarian registry. She thought about Rank tapping her compass before issuing an order that had been decided 200 years ago by 12 people in a conference room who had understood something she was only now beginning to put words to. A promise kept consistently becomes more reliable than any treaty written to enforce it. She had read that somewhere recently. She wrote it down. Then below it, She wrote the opening line of the report she would spend the next 6 days drafting, the one that Meyerth had assigned her, the one that would circulate through 12 assembly committees before anyone decided what to do with it. Earth's response to the Coromny distress call does not fit existing assembly categories for military action, humanitarian aid, or collective defense. It is, as best this office can determine, the execution of a promise. She looked at the line. She did not cross it out. 90 days after the engagement, the Coromny Way Station's second docking arm was fully operational. The repair had been completed by Bose's foundry crews working alongside Coromny engineers, on schedule, with 3 days to spare. The sensor denial nets nodes had been recovered and reloaded into the foundry ship's bays. The humanitarian manifest had been refiled with the Assembly Secretariat, listing the same 41 vessels, the same 7 medical logistics units, the same classifications that had been on file for 11 years. The classification error remained uncorrected. At Holloway Yard, Fleet Marshal Rank signed the final after-action report and transmitted it to the Directorate at 800 Ship Standard. The report was 41 pages. Its summary was 3 sentences: Cradle Doctrine, 5th Activation, Primary Objective Achieved, No Earth Personnel Lost. She set the signed copy in the outgoing tray. She looked at her desk, the stack of requisition forms, the cold coffee, the cracked brass compass sitting where it always sat. She tapped it twice. The needle held at 13 degrees off true, not pointed north, not fixed, just different from where it had been by 1 degree, for reasons she could not explain and had not tried to. In the Tessari Diplomatic Archive, Iravel Das's report was filed under a category that had been created specifically to hold it, because it did not fit any existing category. The category's name, assigned by a senior archivist who had read the report twice and said nothing afterward, was Responses Without Precedent. The report's final paragraph read, "The Drenic Ascendancy has filed a formal grievance with the Assembly Secretariat. The grievance cites misrepresentation of vessel classification under humanitarian registry. Earth's response, transmitted through the Assembly's standard diplomatic channel, was 4 sentences long. The last sentence read, 'We weren't asked to send an army. We were asked to send help. We decided those were the same word.' This office has no further comment at this time." The Assembly opened informal discussion, for the first time in 31 years, about what the phrase Relief Committee should actually mean. The discussion was ongoing. The Coromny Way Station's lights were on.